Okay, looks like we just started. So I just got done compiling some information about the speech I watched. Then the speech I watched is, of course, it was the great speech of the late, great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And this was delivered on August 28th, 1963, in Washington, D.C., at the Lincoln Memorial. So, when I looked over the main points of the speech, there were so many of them that were condensed into a small 15 to 17-minute speech. So, Dr. King went to Washington, D.C. in 1963, and he stood in front of the Lincoln Memorial. And he addressed the crowd about how segregation and discrimination have been substituted for slavery. And this has resulted in African Americans being outcasted from the normal functions of society. Dr. Martin Luther King, he goes on and he talks about how the founding fathers of our nation wrote a promissory note that every American was entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, no matter what the color of their skin was. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stated that the promises that were made by the founding fathers had not quite been granted fairly to the African American sect of society. And Dr. King, in a way, he came to Washington, D.C. and across the country in this era to cash a check for what was owed to the African Americans, and kind of what I get for other ethnicities too, that the cashing the check for what was owed to everybody, which is just freedom. That is the promissory note that was promised. During Dr. King's speech, he spoke out strongly against gradualism, and this part kind of gets overlooked in the speech by a lot of people. And gradualism, spoke against it because this is racial segregation. Excuse me, he spoke against gradualism to get past the racial segregation. He demanded that rights would come sooner rather than later, and if not immediately. And he also believed that this was in the best interests of our nation to get past segregation. Sorry, I'm tripping over my tongue a little bit. So Dr. King, he spoke a warning to those who believed that African Americans were just blowing off steam, that action was indeed coming, and those who believed otherwise were soon be in for a rude awakening. He described that there was just this whirlwind of change coming in to restore the rights of the African Americans. So maybe not restore is not the proper word, but it's coming to give them the rights that they never had. Dr. King, he urged his fellow African Americans against the bitterness towards white people. It means to restore African American rights. That violence is not a good way to facilitate desegregation. He also went too far to say that African Americans should not distrust white people, but to look at them as brothers, because that we all share the same destiny, and that white people's freedom is shared by black people's freedom. Dr. King, he went on to talk about the crimes that were listed against African Americans, that no one should be satisfied as long as these crimes are taking place. Some of these crimes are bigotry. Some of these crimes of bigotry included police brutality, voter suppression, segregation in public places such as like hotels and restaurants. Sorry, I'm really not that great of a speaker. Dr. King seems to honor those in the crowd, and he talks about the perils that each person in attendance had to go through just to get to the rally. And he then talks about how each person in attendance should go home and encourage, knowing that civil rights will soon be changed. And this again was spoken with an underlying tone against gradualism that's coming. You be prepared. Throughout the speech, Dr. King makes references to some of the Deep South where racism has just become socially acceptable. Not just in the lower class areas like Mississippi, but we're talking about places in high influence, such as the governor's office in Alabama. The famous quote, I have a dream is spoken, and Dr. King talks about how the nation will rise up and truly acknowledge that all men are created equal, and that all people of all races will be able to sit together and break bread. Children will one day live in a nation, where they're not judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. So when Dr. King starts to wind down his speech, talked about how all races will join together and stand up for another, and that everybody from every corner of the country will come together and free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. So when I talked about the nonverbal cues that Dr. King used to convey this message, I kind of looked at people who study the oculesics, which is the study that people use their eyes to communicate this particular speech. I'm sorry. It is the study about how when people look at the eyes, how it communicates messages, and that they might find the speech intriguing because the message that Dr. King is conveying is that with his eyes as well as his words. One particular nonverbal cue that I caught while watching Dr. King is how he continuously looked back and forth across the crowd, as if to signal to every individual in the audience that, hey, you are important, your struggle is real, and I'm here to help. This is an amazing example of creating immediacy, which is a feeling of closeness, which involvement and warmth between people. And that's crazy because he was talking to hundreds of thousands of people at the moment there. I don't know the exact statistic, but it was a lot. And I genuinely feel that Dr. King was trying to make as much eye contact with as many people as possible, even though his eyes are in a constant state of jumping up and down from the page, like mine aren't, but I'm jumping down from the computer screen, and I'm obviously not conveying it as well. Another cue, nonverbal communication or cue that Dr. King was expressing was just how he uses the environment. And it's very symbolic that he was speaking in front of the Lincoln Memorial, and that just showed that change was possible and very much likely in the future, just as long as Americans stay the course, much like Abraham Lincoln had done. Some listening challenges I had while listening to the speech. A particular challenge I had was, and I'm ashamed to admit it, was watching the speech with overconfidence and laziness. I truly felt that I knew everything that was about to be said. Some of those words in the speech have gone on to become catchphrases of the American psyche, especially when Dr. King says, I have a dream. However, when you dig deep into the speech, you learn a lot more than you probably would have at first glance. Like gradualism was something I didn't really know about. Selective listening also played a negative part for me while listening to the speech, because at the beginning of the speech, I was set on taking the bullet points from what I've referred to already as catchphrases. It took me a few listening sessions to piece together what his message was in its entirety. Some of the kind of the activities that distracted me. Not too many things distracted me from this ability to listen to a speech. Once I got into it, feeling worked against me was probably just fatigue and maybe just my busy lifestyle, which is kind of just a constant plague on when it comes to studying. As far as tasks go that I can do without affecting my listening, I kind of find that I can type very well while the speaker is talking. That's really great when I'm listening to online lectures. And well, up here near Seattle, I can drink coffee like no other, and that's great too. So this is the conclusion of my assignment. Signing off. Thank you.